Alrighty, folks. This is the history of psychology, part one. You should be on vocab number two. And so vocab number one should all be finished with those first three lectures that we did. Now you're over to vocab number two. The purpose of this part of unit one is we're going to take a look at the history of psychology, kind of an overall view. These next 2 days, you're going to go rapid, fast. With the material, but it's to give you a sort of a preview of what the rest of the year is going to be taking a look like. Sorry, I just forgot to set up my timer here. It's going to be giving you a preview of what the rest of the year is going to look like. So don't worry so much about the details. I don't need you to know the difference between operant and classical conditioning, or what the ego, the superego specifically do, but what I need you to do is sort of know the order, know the changes, know that as we get later on, it becomes more about medicine and taking the science and the theories and sort of putting them together. Whereas early on, you were just sort of throwing darts at a wall and seeing what stuck. So that's what we're going to take a look at here. We're going to take a look at the history of psychology. This lecture will be part one, which will take us up through psychoanalysis and Freud. As well as IQ testing, and then your next lecture will pick up with behaviorism and take us up to the modern day. So with that in mind, let's move forward here. Here we go. So again, the purpose of this lesson, give you an overview of psychology. There's many different perspectives of psychology. There's many different types of therapy when it comes to psychology. That's like when somebody goes, I tried therapy, but it didn't work for me. That's like going out on a date with one person and you go, I tried dating, it doesn't work for me. There's so many different types. There's hundreds of different types of therapy that are all locked into these 7 contemporary schools of thought: psychoanalytic, behavioral, humanistic, cognitive, neuroscience, evolutionary, and sociocultural. And of course, psychoanalysis, just in general, to give you sort of an intro of what we're talking about, psychoanalysis means that whatever your problem is, it's deeply rooted. There's something in your past. Whereas behavioral, everything we are is learned. We're sort of born a blank slate, and we're an accumulation of what we've learned. Humanistic says that no matter who you are, you're just trying to be the best you can be. Cognitive is how we think. Cognitive thinking. So if I think positively, more positive things are going to happen. If I think this is scary, it's more likely to be scary. So I got to change the way I think. Biological is there's my amygdala is a little bit off. There's a little bit of a problem communicating with my neurotransmitters. So maybe medication is the way to even that stuff out. Evolutionary just basically says the best genetics have moved forward through life. And through natural selections, and that's why we are better people now than we were 400 years ago. And sociocultural is how we allow those around us to have an impact on who we are, which is different from sociology, because sociology is how does this group impact that group? It's how do the group dynamics impact me as an individual? So in essence, to sort of give you a broad interpretation of this from a therapeutic standpoint, if you were afraid of, let's say, flying, you're afraid of flying on an airplane. If you went to a psychoanalyst, he would go, well, let's look at your past. There's something when you were a child, maybe you had an airplane and it broke and you don't trust planes, maybe your mother ran away with a pilot, whatever. Behavioral goes, you know what, you weren't born being afraid to fly. So you learned it. So anything you can learn, we can definitely unlearn. The humanistic therapist would go, well, don't you want to be a better you? And to make yourself a better you, is flying necessary? I mean, if it's not necessary, we work around it. But if it is necessary to be a better you, shouldn't we sort of take that on? Cognitive therapists would say, the reason you're afraid of flying is because you focus on all the stories about the planes who crash. Let's go to Hobby Airport. Let's go to Intercontinental or Georgia Bush Airport, and let's watch them all take off and land. You're thinking of it wrong. You're looking at the wrong statistics. Neuroscience is just, getting on the plane, claustrophobia, make your amygdala go a little bit. Here's a pill, low volume, calm you down. Evolutionary would say that the stronger people fly because that enables them to get the better jobs and be able to travel and see the world, and you don't want to be one of the weak ones. And then sociocultural will be, I've seen other people fly, I should fly too. So it could be one of these 7 perspectives, or it could be a combination platter of all of them. So again, it's different ideas about things that we already know, and it's just sort of taking a look at ourselves from an objective perspective, which is always hard, which is why you need to go get help, because we don't look at ourselves very objectively. Origins of psychology, I mean, if you really want to take it back, you can go back to the Greeks, where Plato said the brain is the mechanism of mental process. Aristotle would talk about the heart. So there's the mind and there's the heart and everything that Shakespeare wrote. And then in the 19th century, we started to get into a little bit more of a science and saying it's the building blocks of life, and you know, you've got the weight of this versus that, and we're trying to find a balance, and things that attract and things that repulse, and all these other, there were general ideas about the human experience and everything else throughout time, because we've always been human since humans have been around, and we've always had insecurities, we've always had strengths, we've always had weaknesses, we've always had drives, we've always had all these things. But nobody really sat and looked at it objectively as a whole society. And this is the kind of the timeline of the development of psychology, which you can go back, and we talked about the ancient Greeks, and we talked about, or we haven't talked about, but you go back to the stories of the Middle East and beliefs of human condition and everything else, and Europeans, and these are all kind of isolated from one another. And then as we start to become more industrialized, and as we start to move closer and closer together, and we become more urbanized, we start to want to study people, because we're not living out in the farms by ourselves our entire lives. We're seeing others, and we want to know what makes them tick. And that's sort of what brings psychology along. And again, the mid-1800s is when this comes around, where we start to just don't look at it just philosophically, but can we put it as a science? And some hits and misses that went along the way. Phrenology is a great example. I got one over here. This guy right here is what you sort of see down there. And the idea of phrenology was basically the idea that each part of the brain is responsible for different thoughts. So this is responsible for being timid. This is responsible for savings. This is responsible for perfection. You know, and you can see the same thing sort of mapped out in the brain. Now, there's a little bit of truth to this, because there are different parts of your brain that are responsible for different things. More motor movement, automatic movement is the cerebellum down here. Up here is your frontal lobe, which is more logical, long-term thinking. Within here is the amygdala, which is sort of a barometer of fear. So there are different parts of the brain that says we're responsible for different things, but it's not this specific. And also the idea was this: if I've got somebody's head, what I would do is I would feel their skull, kind of like reading a palm. I would feel their skull, and if I saw a bump over here, oh, you've got sort of a little bump here, you're a very moral person. Ooh, you've got a little bit of a divot here, so you don't believe in justice. I can have a mole on my hair or in my head, or whatever the case may be. So it's philosophically, there's some accuracy to it, but the reading of it was way, way, way off. And again, our brain is not that specific on where things are located or memories or anything like that. So good shot, but not quite there. So again, there are different things that the brain is responsible for, but not that specific as far as emotions and whatnot. So let's take them one by one. We'll start with late 1800s. This is kind of when psychology becomes a bit of a science. And we're going to start with the idea of structuralism. And structuralism is basically saying that we want to see how somebody is built, a structure. You're building, you're an architect, and this goes on top of that, and goes on top of this, and goes on top of that. And when it's all there together, how does it function? How does it work? That's structuralism. And in order for me to see how somebody works, I gotta not necessarily take them apart, but I gotta talk to them about, why do you do this? What do you think about this? What do you? And so the idea of the psychologist is to basically track what somebody else is saying and read it back to them. if you would, and organize it, but just read it back. Don't look into it. Don't try to interpret it. This is who you say you are, and I'm going to tell you who you say you are. William Wundt it set up the first psychology laboratory in Switzerland at about this time. So his idea was, through self-reporting and everything else, who are we? What is our structure? How are we built? So that's sort of the first philosophy. So it focused on breaking down the mental process, not the function, but just the components of who we are. Again, the idea of introspection, your belief about you. Now, again, other people in later schools of thought would say, well, that's wrong because your ego isn't necessarily going to share everything, and you're going to put on an idealized self and everything else. But this is the first step where we go, okay, you're unique. Let's talk about you, and let's talk about what makes you go through. So it's a scientific study. There's data. I'm happy here, I'm angry there, whatever. You're observing yourself. You're having an inner experience. And every living being has an inner experience. We've always had it. So this is the beginning of our mental life, and this is the beginning of psychology. So again, William Wundt, structuralist, how am I built? That's the first school of thought. There is his laboratory right there, picture of him right there. The beginnings of a differentiation of mental function can be found even in the protozoa. It's the smallest things even have structure to them. And again, with our brains being more complex than amoeba or that of monkey, we're going to be a little bit harder to observe and whatnot. The second school of thought after this, which wasn't much later, was functionalism, where William James came along. Now, structuralist goes, okay, this is how you're built. You are built like, we got a pen and marker here. This is a marker, and I take the cap and I put the cap on top of the marker, and it's got ink inside of it. This is the structure of it. The marker can tell me this, I'm blue, and this is what I do, and I have words on me, and I feel this is my purpose, and all these other things. So that's structural. Functionalism is, how does this marker function when I put it in different environments? When I put it in the cup and it stands there, does all of its ink just come down? When I open it up and I write on paper, versus if I write on a whiteboard, versus if I try to fill in something here, how does it function when it's put with different things? That's functionalism. So again, you could be a structured person. You could be intelligent, you could be athletic, you could be charming, and all these other things. But just because I'm intelligent or charming, I am, but if you put me in a party with 1,000 people, or you put me in a one-on-one situation, do I function the same in both of them? So if I am somebody who was raised in the city, how do I function in an agricultural sense, or vice versa? And again, we're talking about the 1890s. We're talking about people becoming urbanized with the Industrial Revolution. So this idea of not everybody's acting the same, not everybody's functioning the same. Well, first off, we're structured different, but there's also this different adaptability that we have. So again, rather than focusing on the elements of consciousness and everything on the surface, what is the purpose of our consciousness? Okay, and James was also one of the first to come up with what's called the theory of emotion. And it's the mind's perception of our physiological conditions. And he also came up with something which we'll talk about more down the road when we talk about emotions, the facial feedback theory. If I smile, I'm naturally happier. If I frown, I'm naturally sadder. If I shuffle my feet, I'm less motivated than if I walk with a purpose. It's not that my motivation causes me to walk with purpose. To walk with purpose can sometimes give me motivation. They did a study, I forget what this was, but they did a study where they gave somebody a pencil and they had them watch a movie. And as they're watching the movie, one group was asked to watch the movie with a pencil on their lips like this, sort of a pouting, not very happy way. The other group was asked to take the pencil, shove it way back into their mouth, forcing their mouth to go up and forcing a very Jack Nicholson 1989 Batman smile on their face, like he's a Joker, and they were forced with a smile to watch the film. And then another group was just asked to watch the film. And then what they discovered was the control group had this level of enjoying the film. Those who had the pouty face enjoyed it less. Those who had the forced smile enjoyed it more. So again, how we function, how does our body, when my body feels good, does that affect how I function? because everything psychological is physiological. So the way my body feels can affect my mental process, and my mental process can also affect the way I feel. So all of this is functionalism, this holistic sort of thing. That starts in the 1890s. And there, again, you've got William James with some quotes. There is but one indefinite certain truth, the truth that present phenomenon of consciousness exists. And so we have to take a look at ourselves, but not just look at ourselves, but what is ourselves in all of these different adaptable environments. And again, he's the first one to write a textbook as well. The next one that came up was something called the evolutionary perspective, opposable thumbs. This was Sir Francis Galton, was the first one who came up with this. Had a cousin by the name of Charles Darwin. And so Galton and Darwin being in the same family, they shared the belief that the good genes are passed on. Good things are passed forward. We're nicer people now than we were years ago because the bad traits would hopefully disappear and thin out. Things that were not good for humans or society as a whole would die off. And so he believed in that. He believed that intelligence runs in families, that smart parents are going to have smart children, successful parents are going to have more successful children. But again, an argument against that is it really, am I passing my DNA intelligence down to my child? Or if I am a successful parent, is my child more likely to be successful because I'm giving him a certain socioeconomic condition? So, but evolutionary, it was all in. It was all on one side. Didn't take other things into the equation. Everything was heredity. Everything that you are was predetermined. You're preordained when you were born to be this. Now again, most psychologists today in the nature versus nurture argument, and that's a huge, huge debate throughout psychology, is how much of us is we were born that way and how much of us is due to our environment. And basically, for most things psychologically, it comes down to about a 50-50 cut. About half of who we are, we were given certain DNA, temperament, whatever, but then half of who we are, it was based on our environment. And any changes in the environment or changes in the DNA could have a broad impact on that. And you can see this through twin studies, fraternal twins, identical twins, twins separated at birth, and kind of see this 50-50 thing. Only exception to this is intelligence. Intelligence is more 75 DNA, 25% environment. Again, Charles Darwin, survival of the fittest, really believed in this. But one of the problems with this in the early 1900s is this idea of natural selection. They invented a term called eugenics. And eugenics was basically, we want to take the good people and put them with the good people. The idea is, if you've got wonderful people with wonderful people, you're going to have wonderful babies. And if we've got people who are criminals, or we have people who are maybe physically disabled or mentally disabled or criminals, we should castrate them. We should sterilize them. They should have criminal kids, because if we have criminal people, they're going to have criminal babies. We want to stop the criminal babies, just sterilize them. So we have the great people get together, and we have the bad people sterilize, and now we weed out the bad people. Here's a trick with that philosophy. Is a lot of people, when they hear me say that, they're like, that's not the worst idea. It sounds pretty good. That's what Hitler thought too. So, you're hanging out with Hitler's ideas if you think that. There's got to be other ways. You don't want to give them, because who's going to determine who's good and who's bad and all those other things. All right, so again, a little bit with Galton there, who basically felt that families are going to pass on their characteristics, which they do through DNA, but they also do through environments. But then there's a little bit, how's the oldest treated versus how's the youngest treated. When you're the oldest child, your parents are brand new. And when you're the youngest child, your parents are a little bit more experienced. And I would make the argument that you may have brothers and sisters, but you weren't raised by the same parents, because your parents had different levels of experience, different levels of financial stability, or whatever could have been in the equation there. Next one that we're going to talk about here is what's called Gestalt psychology. And anytime we talk about Gestalt, we're talking about taking something as a whole. For example, if I were to show you this, and I say, what is this? You would go, well, it's a highlighter. Yeah, that's true. you would say it's a highlighter. But what you wouldn't go is it's a bunch of plastic that's formed and it's some ink on the plastic. And then this is sort of a spongy form. And then there's ink inside of there, which sort of goes, you don't look at all the parts. Just go, it's a highlighter. And your concern is how do all these parts come together? Because when we look at something, we don't look at all the individual parts. When I look at an automobile, I don't look at it, you know, the wheel and the steering wheel and every little nut on it, every little screw inside it, and the plastic dashboard. I don't look, it's a car, because we can only sort of process things, a few things, 7 to 9 things every 30 seconds. So I want to take things as a whole. It's easier to see them as a whole than it is little individual parts. So the Gestalt psychology philosophy is we look at things as a whole. I take a look at this right here, and what I see is a triangle, because I want this to be one thing. Yet it could also be 3 Pac-Men getting ready to have sort of a kamikaze mission on each other. I take a look at this, and it looks like a sphere with spikes coming out of it. Or you may take something you've already seen before and put it with that. Call it the sun. I'll tell you what, if this rises in the morning from the east, we're all in a lot of trouble. Over here, you take a look at this, and it's just sort of 3 little squiggly things, but some people will go, it looks like a snake going through a river, and some people will even go to their memory and pull up something that's similar to it and call it the Loch Ness Monster. So we want to take things that have some sort of similarity to them and look at them as a whole. You take a look at this. This is my signature over the years. This was me in high school. My signature was very much like my father's because I used to have to forge checks. He would travel out of town, bills were due. Rate cards as well. Then this was, this one over here was high school, this was college, and now it's evolved to this. There's this big J, A, S, O, N. You don't look at the little parts, but you look at this as a whole thing, and you go, yeah, that says Jason for sure. As a whole, but the individual parts, that's not a TER, but when you put this with this, it suddenly you can read it. So we take these things as a whole. We want things to make sense because we can only process a few things at a time. So that's Gestalt psychology. And then, the next one, second to last one we'll talk about today, is what's called psychoanalytic theory. Now, get ready for the fun. Psychoanalytic theory. This is where psychology starts to take some artistic license, if you would. Because again, it's all based, there's no real science at this time. We can't really look at how the brain works and everything else. So a lot of it's just theory. And the psychoanalytic theory was this idea of the unconscious. And we all have it unconscious, all of us do. When you're walking, you're not thinking of every little steps. You're doing that subconsciously, unconsciously. You're just sort of doing it. You know, when I'm inhaling and exhaling, it's happening unconsciously because I'm not thinking about doing it. Well, it's not just these survival things that are happening unconsciously. A lot of our thoughts happen unconsciously. You know, why when I'm making a left-hand turn and putting the wheel this and my foot on the pedals, because I've done it again and again and again. I'm not thinking about it. It's unconscious. So all these things that I've practiced, but then sometimes a thought could be unconscious as well. I just don't like that person. That person gives me a vibe. I just feel weird. Anxiety is not conscious. Depression is not conscious. It's just a feeling that we have. So, and we've always had it. We've always had it unconscious, and we've always had, you know, why did I do that? I mean, how many times have you gotten to the end of the day and you're just saying, why did I do that? Why did I react like that? Why did I think it? Why did I let that bother me? You know, when you start to consciously think a lot of what you did, sometimes it's a little bit disturbing. So psychoanalytic thought was there was the first time that we took a look at the unconscious and what our motivations were and what influences our behavior. And that a lot of what influences our behavior is what we're not thinking about. It's our unconscious. And this becomes really, really tricky because since you're not thinking about it, you can't prove it's true. You can't prove it's wrong, but you can't prove it's true. And the guy who sort of was the founder of this is this guy, Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud was all about dream analysis. I mean, man's been having dreams since the beginning of time, but he was the first one to go, well, here's what it means. Ooh, you know, and free association, just whatever came off the top of your head, it meant in some way. And he did this through a lot of case studies. So he's looking at people that came to his office. It started with, I think they had muscle aches and back aches, but he couldn't find anything physically wrong with them, so he thought it was psychological. And it's true, a lot of our muscle pain is psychological. Studies have shown today, but he said it was all unconscious. And that's where it starts to get a little bit tricky. So again, psychoanalytic perspective is our unconscious motivates everything, everything. So this is who you are. You are this big iceberg. All right, this is who you show everybody else on the surface. When you see an iceberg in the ocean, assuming there's still some there, this is what you show the world, what the world thinks you are. But there's a lot of you that's underneath there. There's what we show everybody, but there's also all this stuff underneath, which is the majority of who we are. And then Freud also made this argument that there is this ego, id, and superego. These are the parts of our unconscious, and the ego and the superego also unconscious, that really sort of drives us through things. For example, let's take a look at the three parts. The id is the little 2-year-old us. It wants everything. It just wants. I want it now. I don't care. You know, it's the kid at Target who's 2 years old, and mom says, no, you can't have that, and he just lies on the ground. I want it. He doesn't care about the cost. He doesn't care that it's embarrassing to mom. He doesn't think, oh, maybe mom's had a bad day, I shouldn't do this. He just wants what he wants, and whatever it takes to get it, he's going to get. That's the id in us. Those are those little thoughts that we have when you're sitting in a crowded area or church, and a guy is in front of me and he's got a bald spot on his head, and I just think, what if I just whack, hit him on the head? I'm not going to do it, but why do I have that thought? I don't know this guy. Why would I do that? You know, all those little deep-seated things that could be violent, that could be sexual, that could just be, you know, I want that girl. That's a crime. You can't do that. You know, but why? What with the thought? Why is the thought there? You know, what if I, you know, if somebody's, you ever had somebody just talking to you, and you just want to, you know, why do I want it? Why am I thinking about just hurting this person? You know, and people talk to me, I'm just like, I just want a piano to fall out of the sky and crush them, like a cartoon. But you're not going to do that. You don't want it to happen, but why is the thought there? So this is all deep down inside of us. So it's the bad thoughts, it's the devil thoughts. Over here is the superego. These are the righteous thoughts. These are the good thoughts. These are the thoughts of, we're going to be judged by others, so I should be righteous. I should be good. God is watching me, and all these things. You know, you hold the door open for someone else because, you know, you would want them to hold it open for you. You feel guilty about anything you have. You're having a meal. It's wonderful. It's like, but your superego is going, you know what? There's kids that are starving. How dare I enjoy this? When other kids are, I should allow other people to have my meal, and all these other things. So the superego is kind of the angelical one in us. And then the ego's got to balance these two idiots on. You know, it's got to take care of the, yes, I want food that the id wants, but it's also got to balance the superego that it's good food, and that I'm not eating too much food. All those other sorts of things. And that's the kind of the battle that's constantly going on with us. And then according to psychoanalytic theory, when we go to sleep and we start to dream, this guy goes to sleep, and it's the id and the superego. Everything I want happens in our dreams, and it's like, isn't that fun? Or any lie that I told while I was awake, my superego suddenly has a lion chasing me through a forest. And the lions are in the forest, I don't know. But he's chasing me through a forest to punish me for doing something in the conscious world. So all of this is sort of going on. And the other thing with Freud is he basically believed that all of these little drives were devious, were just bad, were just sexual. Everything was about sex, according to Freud. Everything that you do, why are you studying right now? Well, I'm studying right now because I want to go to a good school. Because I go to a good school, I get a good job. And if I get a good job, I can attract someone else and have sex. Everything we do, according to Freud, was about sex. And this got a lot of attention because we're talking about the early 1900s, and we're talking about women with swimsuits down to their ankles. So you got to take him with a truckload of salt. And again, we'll get more into psychoanalysis down the road. If you want to read a little bit more about it, it's all right here, or any Google search I did. The last thing I want to talk about in this lecture, though, is intelligence testing, IQ testing. Because again, we're getting to a more urbanized society. Getting off the farms, and you got people moving to the cities with the Industrial Revolution sort of in full effect. Well, if I got these kids who have been out on the farms and haven't gone to organized public school for years, and I take a 12-year-old that's been on the farm since birth, I can't put him in 6th grade with a bunch of other 12-year-olds because he doesn't know his ABCs yet. So do I put him in 1st grade? Because up to this point, what was happening is they would just show up and the teacher would go, oh, you should be here. And there was no objective sort of way to do it. So this guy by the name of Alfred Binet was the first one in France to come up with this testing that would predict achievement. If you're 10, do you know what a 10-year-old is supposed to know? If you're 15, do you know what a 15-year-old is supposed to know? If you're 7, do you know what a 7-year-old is supposed to know? And again, this isn't saying how you got there. It's not saying if it was nature, nurture, or anything else. It's just basically, are you where you should be? And if you are, that should predict that you in a few years you'll be where you should be. Are you ahead of where you should be? Well, that should be able to predict that in a few years you'll continue to be ahead of where you should be. So he kind of used IQ as a predictor. It wasn't a cause. It wasn't causation, but he thought it was a good predictor of success down the way. So again, Binet in France took this. This was adopted by America in California. It was the Stanford Binet test, and they had to come up with different things for American versus France. But the main idea is we're trying to define normal, which, by the way, is what all of psychology is trying to do. It's always the big thing. Am I normal? But the trick with normal is a relative term. Are you normal to you is really what you have to be concerned about. But this would say, you know, am I a 10-year-old that knows what a 10-year-old is supposed to know? I do. I'm 10 over 10 times 100. That's a 100 IQ. Am I a 10-year-old, but I know what an 11-year-old should know? Well, that's 11 over 10, 1.1 times 100. I got 110 IQ. If I know what a 12-year-old should know, I should be up here. If I know what a 13-year-old is supposed to know, I should be up here. And again, if I'm 3 years ahead at the age of 10, odds are I'm going to be 3 years ahead at the age of 18 as well. So our IQ stays pretty consistent over our lifetime. There isn't a lot of variability. Now, also what's important about an IQ test is it takes about 8 hours and it needs to be personally administered. So don't go online and say, I click, I got 148 IQ. No, probably not. Very, very rarely would you if you're 0.1% of the population. Very, very rare to be in that sort of stratosphere there. You got to realize anything you do on the internet, personality test, IQ test, anything like that, they want clicks. They want you to come back. They want you to send your friends. You know, you're not going to take an IQ test and they're like, wow, you're stupid. How'd you start the computer? They're not going to give you that result. It's always going to be a positive result. It's like someone reading your palm or something. So watch out for that. All right, so that's part 1. That is part 1. That should have gotten you about halfway through vocab number 2. Your next lecture will be covering the history of psychology part 2, which will take it up through modern